I'm pleased to have as our speaker this afternoon, United States Senator James Risch from Idaho, our friend, ULC Commissioner, and Idaho, longtime member of the Idaho State Senate. Bart Davis is about to introduce the senator. Bart?
Yeah, okay, thanks. I appreciate the ovation. I will now watch the video, and I'll excise just that portion for my family. Before I introduce Senator Risch, I'm joined by two former colleagues of mine from the Idaho State Senate. Senator Melinda Smizer back here. She is now working for Senator Risch back in Idaho, and it's very serendipity that I get to see her here today. And then also Senator Risch's Chief of Staff, John Sandy, also served in the State Senate. I served in leadership with him for some time, and he is Jim's Chief of Staff, as I mentioned. U.S. Senator Jim Risch has a historically proven understanding of the principles of federalism and the roles of states. Senator Risch strongly supported the work of the Uniform Law Conference as one of the best financial bargains available to the Idaho legislature. Jim's a pragmatic decision maker. He has spent 39 years in elected office. Now, unlike some who go to law school, then spend their professional career in politics or elected office without a dynamic understanding of a legal practice, courtroom realities, clients' concerns or challenges, or real business troubles, Senator Risch is a full-fledged lawyer and litigator. He spent many years in depositions, hearings, jury trials, and appeals fighting for clients. At age 27, Jim was elected as the prosecuting attorney in Ada County, our capital county, Boise. He spent 2 terms as a hands-on prosecutor, simultaneously maintaining, he then served in the Idaho Senate for 22 years, simultaneously maintaining his partnership status in a prominent litigation law firm. While in the state Senate, Jim served 19 of 22 years as either the majority leader or Senate President Pro Tem. If my math serves me well, Jim was the longest serving majority leader in Idaho's history, at least until next year. Senator Risch then served 2 terms as lieutenant governor, focusing on economic development and breaking in a new majority leader. Senator Risch served as Idaho's 31st governor. During his tenure, he lowered property taxes, helped to set aside a rainy day fund. In that fund, what for us was a big wad of money, principally for public schools, which frankly, Senator Smizer and I know, helped save Idaho's financial backside during the recent recession. While governor, he designed a plan to manage Idaho's roadless areas. About 2/3 of Idaho is owned by the federal government, which is a problem for most western states. The Roadless Initiative is the model of cooperation and pragmatic decision-making. The plan was ultimately adopted and approved by the federal government, and of course, litigation followed, which ended up in the Ninth Circuit. Jim, I want you to know several weeks ago I went to lunch at the Dutch Oven in Boise, and I saw and visited with Judge Trott. Now, to those of you who don't know Judge Trott, he's the former lead singer of the Highwaymen and is a senior status Ninth Circuit judge and happened to be one of the panelists for that oral argument. He told me that during oral argument in Portland, he looked down into the audience, and sitting there was U.S. Senator and former Idaho Governor Jim Risch. Jim was committed to, and is committed to Idaho solving and not just identifying its problems. I might add that the Ninth Circuit sustained Idaho's roadless plan. Well, Senator Risch was elected to the United States Senate in November of '08. Though still in his first term, he, by the way, has announced his intent to run again. He currently serves on the following committees: Foreign Relations, Intelligence, Energy and Natural Resources, Ethics, and Small Business and Entrepreneurship. But unlike almost every attorney in this room, U.S. Senator, former governor, former lieutenant governor, and former pro tem, former majority leader, former active litigator, and former prosecuting attorney James E. Risch never took the LSAT.
That's your achievement.
Join me in welcoming Jim.
That's great.
Art, that's great. Save part of that for my eulogy, since you're always threatening to outlive me. I'm sure they'll love it. Regarding your lack of ovation, Bart, I give a lot of speeches, and I find that you usually get from the crowd what you deserve. So take that as it is. Bart, I'll tell you, I may lose my status as the longest serving majority leader in the Idaho State Senate, but I certainly won't lose the title of having been the best majority leader that the Idaho Senate has ever had. Well, as you can see, Bart and I are good friends and go back a long ways. Indeed, John Sandy's been a colleague of both of ours for many, many years, and we've had good times together. And the same is true with Melinda. Look, I don't, Bart, you took most of my time. I apologize. We've had a wreck here this week, as we frequently do, and I know what I'm supposed to talk about, I guess, and I will talk about that a little bit. I'll tell you a little bit about what's going on here. Would you like to hear a kind of a summary of that and global,
Sure.
and my view of the whole thing? How long do we have here? I've got until about. I've actually got almost an hour I can do here. What do you have a time limit on what you want to do?
I'd say between 20 and 30 minutes.
Okay. All right. Well, let me ramble on here for about 10 minutes, and then we'll do some stuff. You know, I was Bart's giving you my background, and I was elected here in 2008 and started in 2009, and very little has surprised me here. But what has surprised me have really surprised me. First, one of the things that hasn't surprised me is, all of us politicians go out and I've run 32 times, and I always give this speech. The best government is the government closest to the people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'll tell you what, after spending the time I've spent here, I now really believe that, in addition to going out and giving a speech. You cannot believe the dysfunction here. As bad as you think things are in Washington, D.C., I can tell you they are substantially worse than what you think they are. Our legislature, and I suspect it's true in most of your states, the media just loves to malign the state legislature. Is that true in virtually every state? They mock them, they make fun of them, and what have you, primarily because it's just people doing the thing. Since I've gotten here, it became obvious to me, there's 105 members of the Idaho legislature. If you took those 105 people, and by the way, there's not very many lawyers. And one time, I was the only one out of the 105 that was a lawyer. If you brought them here and you turned them loose, they'd have this thing straightened out in about 30 days. And I mean that seriously. The problems are complex. They're difficult problems. But if you boil it down to some common sense solutions that the American people could chew on, you could resolve this. Let me tell you the state of play just a little bit. In the first 4 years I've been here, federal government spent about $3.8 trillion a year. That doesn't mean anything to anybody because nobody knows what $1 trillion is. It's about 11 billion a day. It's about 7 million a minute. And all of that is fine if they had 11 billion a day. But they don't have 11 billion a day. Over this first 4 years, they take in on average about 6.5 billion a day. And so a little bit of math tells you they got to borrow $4.5 billion a day. Now think about that. $4.5 billion every single day. That's what's gone on since I've been here. The national debt was 10 trillion when I got here. Today it's 16.5 trillion. And again, I tell you that, and everybody looks at me and says, yeah, so what? Because you know what? You don't know what $10 trillion is. You don't know what $16.5 trillion is. Nobody does. Your mind can't conceive that. What I do know is I know that this can't go on. Our numbers are really no different than Greece. The only thing that we have that is different than Greece is our credit card has a lot higher limit on it. Greece hit its credit card limit. Ours we haven't hit yet, and the bad news is we don't know where that limit is. I ask every economist, and we see lots of economists here. We see right-wingers, left-wingers, Republicans, Democrats. All of them agree that this can't go on. And I always ask them a couple of questions. Number one, how long can it go on? The most optimistic can put it out 5 or 6 years. The most pessimistic will tell you maybe a couple of years. But this cannot go on. Now, how does it end? Is it a catastrophic end? Is it a slow-moving freight train? Does the house of cards come down, all at once? And you get varied opinions on that. Some of them think it happens quickly. Some think it happens slowly. And you ask, how will it happen? Well, let me tell you how this works, and then you can probably in your own mind decide how it's going to happen. But after I'd been here about a year watching all this stuff go on, I thought to myself, before I got here, I was like every other American, I think. And that is, I'd wake up in the morning and I'd say, I'd read the paper. Oh my gosh, it's terrible. All they're doing. But you know what? This is America. Nothing can ever go wrong here. Nothing can possibly ever go wrong here. We're Americans. We're the strongest. We're the toughest. We are different than every other culture, the thousands of governments and cultures that have gone before us. We're different. Nothing can possibly happen. Then I got to thinking, probably somebody got up in the morning in Egypt 5,000 years ago and walked to work and went by the pyramids and went by all this and said, hey, this is Egypt. Things good here. Nothing can ever change. And that probably happened in ancient Rome, and it probably happened in Greece. That's where I am, and I think that's where every American is. At least I was before I got here and saw what was going on. That, hey, nothing can possibly go wrong here. But I'm telling you, let me tell you how this works. After I'd been here about a year, I said, I don't understand this. How can we be overspending $4.5 billion a day? And they said, well, they borrow the money. And I said, well, who borrows the money? And they said, well, it's the Bureau of Public Debt. I said, well, I've never heard of the Bureau of Public Debt. And they said, well, yeah, it's over on 9th and 8th Street, which, by the way, is about 7 blocks from here. And I said, well, I want to go over and watch them do it. So they organized a field trip for me. And I went over there, and you can't go in there. They don't let the media in there, which is a crime. I walked in there, and they said, Senator, we're so glad to see you. And we never get senators over here. And I said, well, I'm here to see what you're doing. He said, what do you mean? What do we do? We borrow money. And I said, well, how does this work? And they said, well, this isn't rocket science. I mean, the federal government has a checkbook like everybody else, and at the end of the day, it's got a balance. And they pay their bills every night because they're so big they can't pay monthly or weekly. They pay every single day. So the Treasury calls them in the morning, tells them how much they need, and they go out and they borrow. And so I said, well, how often do you do this? And they said, well, we used to do it once a month, and we went to once a week, and then once a day. Now we do it multiple times a day because we got to get so much money. And so they said, you're fortunate. We're about to have one of these auctions. Come on, and you can come down and watch it. So I went down there, and it's a 30-minute auction. First 20 minutes, nothing happened. And I said, well, how much you have to be here? And they said, well, we're trying to borrow about $30-some billion. And I said, well, this doesn't look good. And they said, no, everybody bids at the end because if war breaks out or something, it changes the interest rate. And so sure enough, the last few minutes, everybody bid. They had enough money. They said, well, do you have questions? And I said, man, I got a lot of questions. I said, first of all, I said, why are you borrowing $30 billion? You say you're going to do this a couple more times a day. You only need $4.5 billion a day. They said, Senator, we have to borrow $4.5 billion to pay our bills tonight. We got people figuratively lined up down the street that have loaned us money for 10 years that say we got to have $60 billion today. They pay back every day 50 to 70 billion, but they don't pay it out of anything other than money they borrow that day. They borrow the money to pay them back, plus they borrow the interest, plus they borrow $4.5 billion to pay their bills that night. So where's this money coming from? That day, about a fourth of it was coming from China. About a fourth of it was coming from other countries. About half of it was coming from wealthy individuals, banks, and trusts and institutions around the world. And I walked out. I said, what would happen if you pressed the button and nobody would give you any money? And they all laughed, and they said, well, that can't happen. And I said, well, what do you mean that can't happen? And they said, well, the United States has never had a failed auction. And they said, Senator, did you see on the TV sets, and we were in a room about this big when they were borrowing the money, they had TV sets, and they said, you notice right when the auction closed instantaneously, across the bottom of the screen came a little ticker. It said the U.S. government just borrowed 30 point so much billion and such a percent, and that came up within seconds after the auction closed. And they said if that ever came up and said the U.S. couldn't borrow the money, they said every economy in the world would freeze up in moments, starting with our economy. So I walked out of there, and it took me a day or two for this to sink in. But that's what our life depends on today, is those guys at the Bureau of Public Debt every day being able to press that button and borrow between $50 and $70 billion. That's the state of play today. So, I mean, I got to tell you, it is a frightening experience. It made me angry. It made me sick. No enemy did this to us. We did this to ourselves. And how are we going to get out of it? There's got to be some major. The only thing I can tell you is I don't see how we get out of this without major reductions in federal spending on different programs. Remember we just went through the sequester. Remember how terrible that was? That was 2.4%. Remember I told you we got to cut back 40%? That sequester was 2.4%, and it wasn't of new money. That was a reduction of the increase that was supposed to take place this year. So that's how difficult it is. Look, I've talked long enough about that. Let's talk about our other problems. One of the things I told you one of the things that surprised me was the lack of respect. They don't understand money in this town. Nobody understands money. They don't care about money. They act as if they got all the money in the world. But another problem that surprised me, another issue that surprised me, the treatment of this issue, was what you want me to talk about today. And that is the lack of understanding that the sovereign in America is not the United States of America, but rather the great state of whatever state you're from. And anybody who doesn't believe that, all you got to do is get out the Constitution of the United States and read the 10th Amendment. It is short. It is direct. It is part of the Bill of Rights. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. There isn't anybody in this town that believes this anymore. I shouldn't say anybody. There's the minority. It is a small minority of people who will subscribe to this. Let me give you an example. I voted against the Violence Against Women's Act about a month and a half or 2 months ago, and was widely skewered at home by the media for, he's so insensitive, he just doesn't care about women, and why can't he see what a terrible crime this is? I'm not soft on this issue. I listened to all the heroes give speeches about what a terrible thing this was. I used to do something about this. I put people in prison for this. This is an awful crime. It is a terrible crime. But when you read the Violence Against Women's Act, you read that thing, this belongs to the state. It doesn't belong to the federal government. I don't care what the states do with this. They can put a mandatory life prison sentence on it, as far as I'm concerned. But this is not the federal government's business. But we lost this battle a long, long time ago. There were only 8 of us, by the way, that voted against the VAWA for the exact same reason I just told you. It wasn't because we're soft on the issue, but the federal government's got no business being in this at all. But it doesn't matter anymore. The ends justify the means. Anybody that comes up with an idea here about what's happening back at home and they want to solve the problem, they never go through the exercise first of, you know, maybe I ought to compare this to the 10th Amendment and to Article 1, Section 8, which delineates the powers of the states or the powers that are delegated to the federal government, and see whether this is the proper role of the federal government. That just doesn't happen anymore. Now, we lost this battle a long time ago. When did we lose it? Well, we've lost it incrementally. We did pretty well for a couple of 100 years, but the last 3.5 to 4 decades, the federal government has just exploded. Today, the federal government is twice the size as it was in the year 2000. That's how quickly that we are expanding. I do this exercise when I talk to the high school kids. I say, well, you like the Constitution, been studying the Constitution? Oh, yeah, it was wonderful. They do a good job putting together? Oh, yeah, they did a good job of the Constitution. It's done a great job for America over these years? Oh, yeah. And they sat down and they put together a document that would enable the Congress to address every problem that came up in the United States. Oh, yes, that's true. You guys couldn't be more wrong if you had body parts put on backwards. The founding fathers had just gone through a war. They hated government. They were smart people. They knew that every government that gone before had failed, number one, and number two, had abused its own people before it failed. They didn't want a government that was going to do stuff. They knew they had to do some things. They knew they had to defend the country, deliver the mail, and regulate commerce on navigable streams. That's what they set out to do. They did not create an entity that they put together to manage a $3.8 trillion social safety net system. The exercise I always go through with on this, and this is one of my examples. By the way, I should put this in context for you. You're going to pick this up here after my next statement. But the National Journal last year said I was the most conservative member of the United States Senate. So that kind of puts this in perspective for you. You shouldn't listen to me on the low watermark. Somebody, somewhere along the line, decided that education was a big problem at home, so somebody introduced a little bill to maybe give a little money to the states for education. How do you justify the United States government getting in the education business? And I'm a local news junkie. I watch the news here in Washington, D.C., and I recommend for those of you who live a ways away, particularly on the other side of the Mississippi, to watch the news here. Anybody who thinks that you could take a program dealing with public schools here in Washington, D.C., and craft rules and craft even suggestions for how you teach kids here in the inner city in Washington, D.C., and the same way in Idaho Falls, Idaho. I mean, it is absolutely stunning, and yet that's exactly what's going on today. The best example is, I'll tell you what, my party is as guilty as anybody else. You've all heard of the No Child Left Behind Act, a terrible failure, and it was put together by, so this is the example I use. Can you imagine if the Founding Fathers were sitting around a table, they finished up the Constitution, they did the amendments, and they said, all right, let's all go to the public house and celebrate, and one guy says, you know what? I got an idea. He says, I've been doing some polling back home in my colony, and I found that what people really want is, of course, they want the country protected. We just went through the war. They understand we have other large countries that could attack us, and they want a strong national defense. But, what's really important to them, too, is the education of their children. And so this is what I'm going to propose. We have another provision in this Constitution that says, what we will do is the education of our children is really, really important. Anybody here disagree with that? No, we all agree with that. So what I want to do is put a provision in here that the federal government, the central government that we've just created, can go out, raise taxes in all the states, and then bring that money back to the capital, build big buildings and fill them with bureaucrats who will study education and write rules and regulations and send those rules and regulations out and tell the states they can have their money back if they will abide by these rules and regulations we're writing here in the Capitol. How many of you think they'd have ratified that Constitution? I mean, that's not what those guys had in mind, yet that's exactly where we are here today. Okay, let's move this to your issue on the Uniform Law Commission and the things that you believe in. I read the draft principles of federalism that you guys have put together. I mean, this thing's just outstanding. I wish you'd adjourn this and go on over and meet with your senators and say, hey, guys, I want you to read this. I'm from back home. Remember me? Look, here's a map. A lot of you don't come back anymore, but this is where This is where I live. And I want you guys to read this, because this altar that you're worshiping on here is the wrong altar to be worshiping at. If you want to do these things, come home and run for the state legislature, because that's where these things that you're trying to do here should be addressed. And again, I can't underscore to you how widely ignored the 10th Amendment is and the ideas that the founding fathers had for this country. People say, the media says all the time, I don't understand this. Why do you have gridlock up there? This institution is not designed to do things. The founding fathers hated government so bad, they didn't give us one government, they gave us three. They gave us a judicial branch, a legislative branch, an executive branch, hoping they would all fight with each other and leave the rest of us alone. And it actually worked for a while. But now they've all gotten together, and we're not the better off for it. So in any event, they did not put together a government that would do things. If you wanted to do things, what you put together is a government like they have in Europe. You have a parliament, and the parliament elects a prime minister, and that way you can really do things. I mean, you can operate the social types of governments that they have in Europe. But we have two houses, and on top of that, in the U.S. Senate, nothing can pass unless you get 60 votes out of 100. 60% of the votes. You go, wow, I mean, how can anything pass? Well, you know what? We've done pretty well for 237 years. And the reason it passes is because after you're done biting on each other, you sit down and say, okay, what do we got to do to make this work? And everybody's got to give and take a little bit. And then eventually you get to where you want to be. You know what? I pontificated way, way, way too long. So it's your turn. Tell me why I'm wrong. Somebody, give me some tough questions here. Let's have a conversation about some of this stuff. All right, my work is done here. This is good. All right.
I have a question for you, and I'm in sympathy with very much of what you say, but I wanted to ask this question. It was triggered by your comment about federal taxation. It seems to me that one of the roles the federal government serves is to a certain extent, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but equalize resources available to the states. So let's take education for an example. There may be states that aren't as prosperous as other states and don't have the same amount of resources to spend on education. Should it be permitted for the federal government to raise revenues so as to allocate resources from New York, for example, when I think in the 1920s and 30s and 1800s, this was certainly the case, to allocate resources from New York to underwrite the education of children in Alabama or Texas or Oklahoma? Because that, to me, is a major question and maybe a major reason why, in part, we have the federal structure we have now. So how do you respond to that?
I'd respond by saying, you're kidding me, aren't you? You asked the wrong guy that question. There's other people over there who would give you a different answer than this. The founding fathers had a huge fight over this. And I'm a member of the body that was the compromise for that. They gave 2 U.S. senators to every state to equalize things. But I got a really good friend that's a lawyer in Idaho, and I just had this fight with him yesterday. And I gave him this speech I gave you about what the founding fathers intended and what have you. And he said, yeah, but Jim, look, when you're talking about the Violence Against Women's Act, there's some states that are doing a really good job at this, and there's other states that aren't doing a really good job. You're telling me that the central government was put together to be a paternal overseer of the states? They'd have never passed that back then. Now, admittedly, today, that's what the central government is being used for, but that's a philosophical question. And look, I may vehemently disagree with New York about how they take the guns away from their citizens. I may disagree with that, but I don't disagree with New York. I don't disagree with, well, that's probably not a good example because it's a constitutional right, but on some other thing that New York wants to do as far as age of driving or something like that, I may disagree with them in strongly, but they got the right. They are the sovereign. They have the right to do that. So I don't look at the federal government as being an equalizer of stuff. I mean, you can take that a step further and say, not only do you equalize it amongst the states, what about amongst the people? I mean, we've lost that battle too. Federal government, out of the money they spend, they take in 2.6 trillion a year. The 2.6 trillion that they spend, 51% of the income earners from the bottom to 51 provide nothing. Out of all the 2.6 trillion, the top 10% provide 70% of that money, and the middle, the people from 51% to 90%, provide 30% of the money. So they've already done what I think is just a disastrous situation of doing just that and saying, well, we're all in this boat together. Let's all sing Kumbaya. Get out your wallet. If you got something, give it to the guy that doesn't. We've lost that battle too, to a large degree. So anyway, now you know why I'm the most conservative member of the United States. Wait. I think this gentleman was next here. I respect your opinion, by the way. I just disagree, but I respect your opinion. And you are in the majority up here. I'm not.
Well, and I think the trade-off is there a way to share resources while at the same time preserving the flexibility for states to innovate, and that may be also where that's an alternative.
It's a good discussion to have.
Senator, unlike you, I've never served in high elected political office, but I have served in low elected political office. And in my local government, in my local role, the observation that I have is that everybody comes to me when they want something. No one ever comes and says, you're doing a great job, keep doing it. No one ever comes and says, everything's fine. They come and they say, give me this or give me that. And it strikes me that part of the dynamic that occurs, that has resulted in what you described, is the human tendency not to want to be the waitress who says, "Oh, sir, this is not my table." You know, you'll have to wait till someone else comes along to do what you want to do. So I think you're fighting an uphill battle, and although my political views might be very different from you on many issues, on this issue they're not so different. We're fighting an uphill battle because of the human tendency of politicians to want to get reelected by saying,
Absolutely.
I'm going to do what my constituent wants me to do. So my question is, how do we fight that uphill battle?
Well, I think, the politicians have got to have the courage to say no. And I know exactly what you're saying. I keep a card like this at the meetings I have every day, and I meet with groups. I meet with as many as 20-some groups a day. The most important thing I do is vote. Then I do meetings. They set me up for every 15 minutes. 90-some% come in, and I give them my speech about how bad off the country is. I mean, they tell me how they need money for this and they need money for that, and this great program. And then I say, you're right. This is a great program. Problem is, the country's broke. And you give them the speech when they're all done. You know what the answer is. Yeah, that's right. But if we spend this money, we'll actually save money in the future by that. That's what you always get. But you're right on that. I mean, there is a human tendency to come in. And the other thing that people don't understand, and I can't understand why we'll let the government pay for it. The government can't pay for anything. The government can't help anybody. The government can help somebody if they hurt somebody, because they can't help them without taking it away from somebody else. You hope it would be somebody else who's alive today. The problem is what's going on is we're reaching down 2 generations and taking money away from them in order to help the people here today. But it is a natural tendency, and what you got to do is the politicians do have to say no. But that doesn't go on here very much. Probably the best example is Social Security. So who was it? Somebody was over here.
I wanted to ask you about Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act, because as you know, it contains a federal definition of marriage. And a group of law professors, one of them comes from Georgetown University Law Center, who led the fight against Obama's health care bill, filed an amicus brief saying that the federal government does not have the power to define marriage and should rely instead on the definitions of marriage in 50 different states. And I was curious as to whether you think that these law professors are correct. The Defense of Marriage Act, Section 3 definition of marriage, exceeds the federal government's powers. On your theory that, had you said to the founding fathers, there should be a federal definition of marriage, they would have laughed you out of the Philadelphia Convention.
Yep.
So should Section 3 be deemed to be, of the Defense of Marriage Act, be deemed unconstitutional as Randy Barnett, Georgetown University Law Center professor and leader of the fight against
First of all, I support the Defense Against Marriage Act. But you are absolutely right about Section 3. And you say to me, how can you do that? Well, I'm not pure by any stretch of the imagination. I listen to what everybody else does. If it's good enough for them on other stuff, it's sure good enough for me on Defense Against Marriage Act, and it's the same thing on abortion. You know, the federal government's got no business being in the abortion issue. But in any event, I do vote for things that should be left up to the state also on the abortion issue. But you're absolutely right. But again, that's what I'm saying is you just don't get that analysis anymore. That is this the proper role of the federal government? We're getting. I see you're getting a little jittery here. We about done?
I am getting. It's nothing you've said. It's just looking at the.
One more question. I'm going to get out.
That's
of here.
fine.
Okay, you're up.
I wanted to ask you whether you mentioned things that surprised you as a senator. When Attorney General Holder came to the Senate hearing, I believe it was the Senate Banking Committee fairly recently, and said that in fact there was a class of financial institutions that were too big to prosecute. We just can't prosecute these institutions because it might affect our financial stability. Was that a surprise to you? And if it was, what do you think we need to do about it?
I didn't hear him make that statement, and I haven't really given it much thought. I'd want to run that. I'd want to run that through before usually, I don't mind pontificating on stuff, even if I don't know anything about it. The problem is understanding that this is being recorded. I don't want this picked up and getting hit over the head on it with it at some time later. This too big to fail. This too big to fail idea is debated here in Washington, D.C. a lot. It's a healthy debate to have. Just as I am which won't surprise you, but I am a disciple of the free enterprise, free market, get the government out of the way idea of how we should handle our economy. Having said that, it only works if there's no monopolies. And so I'm sure you had this kind of discussion when there were monopolies. If you get an institution that is so large within the financial sector of the American economy, you got a problem. And what you do about that, let's leave that for another day. God bless you all. Thank you so much for having me here. You've been very tolerant.
Thank you, Senator.